Welcome to the channel. Here, we provide clear, actionable insights into the complex world of tax and accounting to help your business thrive.
Imagine this for a second. There's a law that has cost your company billions of dollars. And then, one day, it's just gone, wiped off the books. One minute you owe a fortune, and the next, you might be looking at a massive refund check. Well, that's not a hypothetical. It's exactly what happened after a landmark Supreme Court decision, and we're about to untangle the absolute accounting chaos it left behind. So how did we even get here? Well, this whole thing unfolded in a whirlwind. It all kicked off in February 2025 with new tariffs, but almost right away they hit a wall of legal challenges. By May, lower courts were already saying, nope, not legal. The case got fast-tracked to the Supreme Court, and then, boom, in an incredibly quick turnaround, the final verdict came down just a year after it all started. All right, to make sense of this whole mess, we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the Bombshell ruling itself. Then we'll tackle the billion-dollar question, the refunds. After that, we'll see how companies had to clean up their books, figure out some really tricky customer contracts, and finally, how they were supposed to report all this uncertainty to the world. Okay, first up, the Bombshell ruling. And I mean, this wasn't just some legal headline. For any company involved in global trade, this was a financial earthquake. The court's decision was a total game changer. They ruled that the law used to justify the tariffs, this thing called the IEEPA, well, it didn't actually give the government the power it thought it had. So in the eyes of the law, these tariffs were basically null and void from the very beginning. But here's the twist. This is the detail that just created all the chaos. The ruling struck down the tariffs, great, but it was completely silent on refunds. It didn't say a single word about whether companies could get back the billions they'd already paid. And just like that, the entire accounting world was thrown into this massive, confusing gray area. And that brings us to the biggest question of all, the one everyone was asking. What about the money? Could companies actually get back the billions they'd paid under a law that was now, not a law? I mean, put yourself in the CFO's shoes for a minute. You're looking at a potential cash windfall that could be huge for your company. So, do you book it? Do you put it on the balance sheet as an asset and tell investors to expect this money? Well, as you can probably guess, the answer is really complicated. This slide right here really gets to the heart of the problem. On one side, you have the accounting rulebook, which says you can book a future gain if the recovery is probable, which basically means it's likely to happen. But then, on the other side, you have reality. The government hadn't even set up a way to give refunds, and you just knew more legal fights were coming. So how can you call something probable when the path to actually getting the money is a complete mystery? So with no clear rules for this situation, where do accountants even turn? Well, in this really fascinating twist, they looked to the playbook for environmental disasters. The rule is called ASC 41030. Why? Because that rule is all about accounting for massive, unexpected events where you have to recover costs. And a sudden Supreme Court ruling that just vaporizes billions in payments? Yeah, that definitely fits the description. So to even think about calling a refund probable, companies had to go through this 4-step gauntlet. First, they had to somehow analyze a refund process that didn't even exist yet. Next, get the lawyers to weigh the odds of actually winning. Then, management had to officially go on record saying, yes, we're going after this money. And only after all of that could they make the final call. The key here? It's all a judgment call. There was no guarantee at all. Okay, so that's how companies handled the money they'd already paid out. But what about the tariffs they had recorded as a liability, money they owed but hadn't actually paid yet? Well, this leads us to our next big headache, cleaning up the books. This is where we get into a concept called liability derecognition. It sounds fancy, but all it really means is wiping a debt off your books because you're no longer legally on the hook for it. It's pretty much the financial world's biggest sigh of relief. This slide lays out the two different scenarios perfectly. For tariffs you'd already paid, you might have a refund asset, if you could prove it was probable. But for the tariffs you owed but hadn't paid, you could just erase that liability. But there was a catch. You could only do it after your lawyers gave the official green light that you were, quote, legally released from the obligation. But wait, it gets even more complicated, because this didn't just affect the companies paying the tariffs directly. No, most of them had passed those costs on to their customers, which created a whole new puzzle for the entire supply chain. This is the huge ethical and legal question, right? If you get a refund for a cost that you already made somebody else pay, is that money really yours to keep? Or do you now have an obligation to pass that refund down the line? Well, the answer really came down to the fine print. Your contract might have actually spelled it out. If it didn't, a ruling like this is often treated as a contract modification. And even without a specific rule, if you have a history of giving refunds, that can create what's called an implied promise. The bottom line is you couldn't just pocket the cash and call it a day. You had to do the hard work and figure out if you now owed your own customers a refund. So finally, after dealing with all of this internal accounting gymnastics, how do you explain it all to the outside world, to your investors? This is all about reporting in a time of massive, massive uncertainty. Now, for any company that was closing its books when the ruling came down, this created a very specific problem. The ruling is what accountants call a Type 2 subsequent event. All that really means is it's a huge event that happened after the period you're reporting on. So you can't go back and change last year's numbers, but you absolutely have to tell everyone what happened. And you can't just hide this stuff in a tiny footnote. You have to be super specific. You have to describe the ruling, you have to try and estimate the financial impact, and if you can't, you have to come right out and say that. This kind of information needs to be front and center in your reports in big sections like risk factors. In moments like these, transparency is absolutely everything. And that really brings us to the biggest question of all. You know, we think of a balance sheet as this solid, concrete snapshot of a company's reality. But what happens when the laws that reality is built on can just vanish overnight? This whole episode shows us that accounting isn't just about crunching numbers. It's about trying to capture a moving target and trying to navigate a world where the rules of the game can change in an instant.